Welcome. This is the first of three summary lecture installments that you'll be getting this semester in COMM 655, Computer-Mediated Communication and Professional Identity. I'm getting better at that. So this is the first of three units, and I'm just going to be giving you a summary lecture of, all the things I think are important about the readings you're going to have assigned for this first little chunk of the semester. Well, maybe not all the things, but most of the things. And here, actually, let me share my screen, get the PowerPoint up. Um, yeah, and so this first unit, so the whole idea, if you remember, so we've got these three units. The first unit, we're not even going to be talking about the computer-mediated communication aspect of this class. We're going to be talking a lot about the identity part of this class. And really, I sort of like labeled it professional identity work, which, you're going to be reading about other people's identity work, but all of this is supposed to culminate in the first paper that you're going to be doing on what your professional identity is. You're going to be constructing an identity narrative, which we'll talk a little bit about today. But first, let's talk about what identity is. And your first reading, I think, does a lovely job. It is heavy. I'm not going to lie to you, because I think that what the authors have done is really taken a really vast literature and summarized it for you. But it's a vast literature, and they put a lot of things in the reading. So I just kind of wanted to break down some of the major definitions and things so we can start thinking about different ways of thinking about identity. And actually, before I say this, I should say they're different ways of thinking about identity, but they're all correct. They're all different sort of types of identity. And when people do research on identity, sometimes they're only doing research on one type of these identities. But I actually am bringing all three of these identities up, because these definitions of identity, because I want you to consider them all while you're doing your own identity work and thinking about what your professional identity is. So the first thing, and I think actually this is probably the definition that most people think about when people say the word identity, is a personal identity. This is, who are you as an individual? The things that make you a unique person. I have, you can tell these are definitely my examples. I'm introverted. I like chickens. I drive too fast. I have a high need for cognition. These are all things that sort of make me who I am as an individual. And, like I said, normally when people are just sort of talking about like, oh, well, that's totally on board with my identity, they're thinking about who they think they are as a unique individual, how they discriminate from other individuals, okay? But then we have social identity. And actually, I mean, I happen to be somebody who studies social identity a lot in my own research. So this is particularly salient to me. And what I'm about to say might seem a little biased, but I actually think that although when people talk about identity, they're thinking about personal identities the most, I actually think that social identity is the thing that sort of makes the world move the most, because social identity is more than just who you are as an individual. It's who you are as a group, the different groups that you identify with. That's why social identity, right? Who do you have membership with? And then you start to sort of see the world in terms of us and them. And we all do this, right? We think, and it can vary depending on the context. So, I don't necessarily walk around seeing myself as a woman, because you know what, like, it's just who I am, like whatever, I'm sort of used to it. I do identify as a woman. But it's not something that's like really salient to me. But if I'm in a room and I realize I'm the only woman, right? All of a sudden that social identity, it's always there. It's always sort of lurking, but it becomes much more salient. So my social identity, I am woman, Jewish, I'm an academic, I'm a dog owner. Actually, I did a study years ago with a colleague of mine where we talked about ownership as an identity. If you're a gun owner, yes, you own a gun. That's something you have. But if you identify with other gun owners, other dog owners, whatever, like, then all of a sudden it becomes a social identity. Progressive, I'm middle age, right? We can identify as being an older adult or a younger adult, and these are all socially constructed identities. And then there are, and this is actually something that comes out of the organizational literature that I'm less familiar with, but is very relevant to this class, which is role identity. So this is like not like who you are or who we are, but it is what do you do? So, for instance, you could have a role identity within a social identity. I might sort of identify as a WVU fan, but my role within WVU is a professor. Now, again, professor could also be a social identity if I'm thinking about how I'm like other professors. But if I'm thinking about sort of like, what am I supposed to be doing within this network or within this society, within this social group? That speaks more to my role identity. So within, like, you could have a social identity as a member of a family, but your role in that family could be wife, or you might think of yourself as sort of a caretaker. Maybe that's part of your personal identity, but it sort of shifts into that role identity. So for me, teacher, mentor, researcher, administrator at one point, not anymore, but like all of these is because role identities can shift, right, depending on what's going on in the organization. So that is a big overview. And you can read more examples in that reading, of course, of different ways of thinking about identity. And I hope you're already seeing that, all of these things will probably have to do with how you might, define yourself, define your identity in the professional realm. So the other thing that your reading talks about is the process of social identification. Now, I do think, and the author of this chapter is um, he's a big guru in terms of social identity theory and organizational context. And so I think and he even sort of admits that at some point, but I think that it's important to think about organizations, on sort of, I think in the vein that he's writing, organizations are like they're places where we tend to have group membership, right? And like my WVU example, right? I work for West Virginia University. This is an organization. It is my place of employment. But also I, have this identity as a member of the WVU community. It is a social identity, right? And so a lot of the research is interested in is like, well, how do we identify? How do we come to develop that sense of membership? And your reading goes through some very, very specific processes, but overall, right, there's a bare minimum has to be this sort of cognitive connection. Like you have to sense awareness that there is a group and you belong to it. But that's not enough because honestly, if you don't really care about it, then you're not going to feel this strong sense of identification. I mentioned the word salience before. That's a big part of this. Like, is the membership even something that matters? So, yeah, maybe here's a good example. Like, I do identify as Jewish, and at various times in my life, that has meant more to me than at other times of my life. It kind of fluctuates into sort of how important it is as an overall part of my sort of like identity ecosystem. So you sort of make these evaluations about whether or not, like, you might say, yeah, I belong. Like, this is my social identity, but it can fluctuate in terms of how much it matters to you. And then, of course, caring about it, right? Feeling like, there you have some sort of investment in it. And by the way, this doesn't necessarily have to be caring in a good way. Sometimes you might be very shamed or embarrassed of different identifications that you have. But the fact that you even have that sort of emotional response to it means that there's some sort of, identification investment in it. And I have to move my face out of here so you can see outcome of identification here. They had this lovely chart in that book chapter that you're reading this, well, the week that, well, that you're reading in this unit. And these are other like different ways of sort of looking at, the identification process where you've got like who you are and what you value, and then things, and you start to get into like these more stereotypical traits, for instance, like these are things that you realize other people think about your group and things like that. And then you've got sort of the behaviors of identity, like you enact an identity by doing things that you think are, well, prototypical. I have like this another nice vocabulary word down there where you're sort of, because again, if we think about like belonging to a group, we have to have an idea in our mind about what a typical group member is like. And that's our prototype. And I mentioned it's an outcome of identification. Once you sort of go through the process of identification, behavior is sort of what starts to happen. Once you've sort of adopted, right, this identity, you are identifying. It's sort of like I am, therefore I behave. First I identify as a duck and then I walk like a duck. Um, So anyway, okay, so this is like, again, not necessarily something that is organizational specific, but this is a professional identity class. So we're going to start thinking about this more in terms of professional identities, but broadly speaking, all of the identities that, all these social identities you have, there's a reason that we even chop the world up like this. There's a really important reason that we feel the need to distinguish between us versus them, to make a big deal about whether or not people are in our in groups or our out groups, right? We sort of have to, I mean, okay, actually, your reading goes into a ton of them. And some of it is like, if you think about it on an evolutionary level, there's like safety components to it. Like we need to sort of know who we think is safe and who's not, right? Because who could hurt us and where do we belong? Who's going to take care of us? Those types of things. But the research is pretty consistent. And I have all these little words up here that all kind of get at a similar theme, which is like it makes us feel good to have identities, to have these memberships. Part of it is like self-enhancement, self-distinctiveness, which I know you're like, well, how could like conformity be, like saying that I belong, be like distinctiveness? And it's because, right, you get proud, you are proud of the various social identities that you have. And that does sort of help define your personal identity as well, which we'll sort of talk about the blendings later. Self-consistency, right? It gives you sort of like a way to sort of check and make sure that your behaviors are always sort of aligning with who you think you are. Self-knowledge, self-verification, all these like different self, you get it, right? It's like self-enhancement. It's to make us feel good. But there are, back to the organizational components of this, there are really good reasons that organizations want identification too. There are some bad reasons too. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So if you're thinking, and actually this might be a good way to think about this. I want you to be doing the identity work at during in this first part of the unit to sort of think about yourself. I want you to do some introspection and for these next couple of weeks and really think about how you identify or don't identify with various social groups or roles in your life. But I also want you to think about how if you are a manager, for instance, or if you are somebody who is not only invested in some sort of organization, but is trying to help other people be invested, right? You should be very interested in, okay, well, what are the implications of people identifying with the organization, having membership as a group, membership in this group, what are the implications for the organization? And so your reading goes into a lot of that, and I just put a couple of them here. So one reason we care is because people who identify with their organizations have higher job satisfaction. If really feel connected to the place that you're working for, if you consider it a, extension of your social identity, you're going to have greater commitment and you're just going to be happier working for that organization. It is better for workplace adjustment if people are, for instance, new to the organization or there are changes. It gives, again, this is what, if you want to have the perspective of a manager, it also gives the organization more control. If the people underneath, right, in the organization are identifying with the organization can do more of what they want because there's sort of this support for the organization. And workers are more likely to work, and direct quote, as a microcosm of the organization because they feel they are. It's a we are part of the organization. But, and the other column here, I have I mean, if you consider all those positive, and I do, we want job satisfaction, like that's a good thing. But over, oh, I don't even want to say over identification. People who strongly identify with our organization are also more likely to, for instance, keep working for it, even if things aren't working out. They are more likely to suppress dissent because, right, they're sort of going in with they're aligned with the norms of the institution, and anything that sort of threatens that social identity they have is something that people will be uncomfortable with. And similarly, right, organizational identification is results in greater resistance to change, any sort of change with the organization, because people sort of want to identify with what the organization is, and so any sort of change is a threat to that that sense of membership. Okay. So, like I said, double-edged sword. It is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It really just sort of depends on the outcomes. But I do hope that you're sort of starting to see that that feeling of identification towards the organization is kind of like at the core, in my opinion, of everything we do in our professional lives. Um, Everything, lots of it, lots of it. Um, Okay, so that was in a nutshell the main points I want you to get out of that first reading. Although we'll come back to some of it in a couple slides from now. There's some other good stuff in there about sense making, sense breaking, all of this stuff, which again, just put a pin in that and we'll return to that because it is directly relevant to your project. But now, and this is more of like I would say like, we're going to focus, I just said like positive, negative about identification, but I want to focus on some of the potentially more possibly uplifting parts of professional identification, social identification. Um, and one of, the second week of this unit, you have two readings that are assigned. Both of them are academic studies. One of them, the author is once again, the first author of the chapter that you read first. And then there's another study that was conducted with interviews of professionals, but both of them, in my mind, the reason I assign them are both sort of getting at this idea of like, how do people find meaning in their work? And consistent with the theme of this class, it has to do with how they identify. So switching gears from identification with the organization, now we're going to go back into, okay, let's talk about some issues of identification for us. Like, how does identification affect us in a mostly positive way, but mostly. There's always caveats. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to, say these absolutes, mostly. So basically, what I loved about the Bloom et al. Article is the way that they see a calling. And I see some of this when you are asked to sort of describe your professional identity and you didn't have any we hadn't covered the definitions or anything like that, but I see students will often can like talk about their professional identity as like, well, my personal identity is X, and that sort of led me to this professional identity or this career or whatever. And what I love about that is that if you read the Bloom article, you'll see that they are like, that's sort of those are the ingredients of a calling. If you're able to sort of understand how your unique self connects to your work, that is really the makings of feeling like a higher purpose in what you do. So this is like, I mean, I think I would imagine what we all strive for. Work is much more gratifying if we feel like it enhances our unique selves in some way. And likewise, if the thing that we spend so much time doing, if our work actually is connected to us as an individual, if there's something unique about us that makes us uniquely qualified, for instance, to do our work, um, or it allows us to do something that other people couldn't do. Um, that said, you're like, oh, you said it was going to be positive, but you always bring in a negative. Well, it is and it's not. So there is, however, right, obviously like this inherent tension to me saying, well, the whole point, the great thing about a calling is like it enhances like uniqueness, like it taps into like you as an individual, but the whole point is to sort of like connect with some sort of organization or some sort of role, some sort of line of work. So personal identity and social and role identities, in that way, they always sort of like conflict, right? There's like this tension between myself as an individual and myself as a member of some sort of group. But what the authors would say is like, well, that's what the calling is, when you strike that balance, right? So there's always ebbs and flow for you trying to do your things for yourself as an individual, but you sort of recognizing yourself as part of a larger system, a larger network. And the calling is like that sweet spot in the middle, right? When you can actually like find some sort of balance, which I'll come back to in a second. That said, right, if you go too far towards the personal identity, I guess personal identity is going to be in this direction. If you go too far in the way of the personal identity, that's what we call under identification, right? You're not really identifying as much with your work or the organization. You're too unique, and therefore you're going to actually feel sort of isolated in your workspaces. You are not going to be able to connect with the organizations as much, or maybe the people you work with, or the job that you're doing, the role identity. Whereas over identification, that's where we get into some of, on this side, the over identification is where we get into some of those nasty things from the last slide, I think, where you actually have some of your uniqueness disappear, and you have like this sort of over conformity with your work role or your job role. And so you, I think, are more likely to take on some of these, like, but you're more likely to become a little bit more swayed by, organizational needs, for better or worse, right? But yourself as an individual sort of gets overcast by yourself as a member of the group. So as I already said, then, the goal is to sort of like balance the two, to enmesh your personal with your professional, to be able to see what you do as a line of work as something that is an extension of, an enhancement of your personal identity. And I think, and like, this is, I'm very concerned that, like, oh my gosh, if I give these PowerPoint slides and people are just going to think that all you should know is in these slides. And just to reiterate, I do think this kind of summary, like, yeah, I'm trying very hard to give you like a really a big overview or summary of some of what I think are some of the key points in the readings, but I really hope that you will read that Bloom study where they interview these caregiving professionals, pastors, physicians, clergy. They specifically chose people who have chosen lines of work that involve a lot of service or caretaking for other people. And then they analyzed the stories that they got in these interviews to kind of see if they could figure out the themes with how people started to feel a calling. How did they strike that balance between personal and professional? And two different things, two different themes emerged. They said, there wasn't one path to sort of like seeing your calling. Some people were what they called discerners. They engaged in discernment. And these are people who had this emerging of their calling through, they say, true self-knowledge, introspection, comparing their selves to examples, and receiving wise guidance, mentorship from other people. These people, at least my impression from the readings, were people who kind of always maybe even had sort of an idea that they had this calling, but then they kept like sort of paying attention and going towards it. And, they had sort of like their path cultivated by like different experiences along the way. And then there were explorers, people who found their calling through exploration. The authors say that this was a lot more gradual, right? It didn't, and again, not to say, I don't think they're saying that discernment is a process where it's like, aha, I found my calling and, everything is good now. I think what they mean, though, is that the discernment people may have already sort of had a sense, and they kept working towards it, where the exploration people, it was a lot more of trial and error for them. So they may try a lot of different things out. And sometimes it may even be, I like this idea, propelled by a sense that something was missing from their work, kind of like, this isn't quite fitting. And so they go to the next thing, and they go to the next thing until finally something feels right. Or maybe they have some fortuitous event that like somebody's just like offers them a job, something they've never even thought of, and it kind of is in their lap, and all of a sudden it's like, aha, right? But back to the balance part, you can see the rock balancing, trying to get really literal with this. It's really about the integration of personal authenticity. So we're talking about, now I'm using Bloom's language, but I'm trying to connect it back to what we were saying about the balance between the personal identity and the social identity. Personal authenticity and professional legitimacy to achieve a fusion between self and work. And again, I don't think they're saying anything different. They're just using different words. Personal authenticity, people need to feel like whatever they're doing in their work connects to who they are as a unique individual. but they also need professional legitimacy. That word legitimacy, right, is something that is ascribed to you by society or by other people you work with. So this is a social function. You need to feel that whatever you're doing, professional legitimacy is like good work, right? And the only way that you get that sort of assessment is through um, some social judgment, right? It's legit. Well, this is actually a nice way to sort of like go into the next slide, because not all jobs are considered socially legitimate. There are a lot of professions that are stigmatizing. And the other article, which was written a little while ago, 1999, but I have to say is still so relevant, I think, is all about dirty work. And this is another Ashforth article. So this is the guy who wrote the book chapter that you were assigned in week one. And he's really interested in this idea of dirty work and how it is that people don't just do dirty jobs, but actually they can also find a sense of meaning and calling. Even though most of the world stigmatizes them, they're still able to really feel a strong sense of purpose. So he's done a lot of research sort of trying to understand how even people who are in professions that maybe other people would frown about, and I have, like various examples in these pictures here. This is supposed to be like a car salesman. The keys, it was hard. These are coal miners over here, mortician, I think. I mean, I don't know. I guess she was a mortician. This is Saul, from Better Call Saul, a lawyer, because for the record, again, and on top of things that I'm not going to discuss in this summary lecture, well, I am, but I'm not going to discuss in detail, but I really hope you spend some time with in the article, is he explains that like a lot of jobs that are like high, they have a high level of prestige associated with them, like white collar jobs, like being a lawyer, are also stigmatized if you think about it. So there can be like low prestige jobs, like being a garbage collector, where it doesn't have a lot of prestige and it's considered dirty, but there can also be high prestige, like white collar jobs that are considered to be morally reprehensible in some way. So it's kind of like, we understand that it's like an impressive thing that you got like a job as a lawyer and you went to law school, but we don't trust you, right? There's different types of moral disgust that we have towards certain things. And some things are just because it's ew, gross. You are dealing with dead people or you're cleaning out septic tanks or whatever. Like we associate it with like that kind of disgusting things. And then there's like things that maybe people aren't getting their hands dirty, but they're getting their morality dirty. So I can't, this is supposed to be a summary as much as I want to talk about it, but go ahead and dig into that article, because I think it's really interesting and insightful to think about how we think about all of these different professions. Anyway, back to the main thing, the main question is, we just talked about how, okay, yeah, all these pastors and physicians and things like that, they can feel like they can have a calling. How is it that people feel a calling, even if they're in work that is delegitimized by a lot of society? And I'm going to summarize this quick as quick and dirty as I can, pun intended, and just say that really it's because even if they don't, what the theorizing is even if people are in a profession where where they are delegitimized by a lot of people in society, their social identity, their social membership in a work culture actually is all that matters. And that's where they get the legitimacy from. So this is another reason why social identity is so important. And so you see down here, strength of occupational work group culture. I'm trying to make this connection to make this a little easier to understand. I hope I don't confuse it. And if so, just ignore what I'm saying, but a strong social identity with one's work group. So if I am, what would be a good stigmatizing job? If I'm a coal miner and I know that people look down on my work, right? Because they consider it to be whatever, too blue collar or, too dirty, and it's associated with like health problems or whatever, then what's really important is how I identify with other coal miners, right? Other people in that work. And then what happens? And again, you can read all the juicy details about the science of all this, but this is all classic sort of social identity processes here. When you have this social connection to other people, who are in the same line of work. You can defend yourself against perceptions that your work is less than by condemning the condemners or in supporting supporters, making selective social comparisons. So social comparison is sort of like where you're like comparing yourself to another group and saying how your group is either, better or worse relatively. And these are all things that, again, it's one thing if you do it on your own, but when you are in when you have membership in a group that's sort of helping you do it, you form this sort of collective identity that's really powerful and motivating these perceptions. And also there's all these are reframing, recalibrating, refocusing. These are all coping strategies that people can engage in when they are feeling marginalized in some sort of way. And this isn't to say it's easy, and it's not to say that the stigmatization that we have of people who belong to different, professions, um, it even, I'll tell you the honest truth. I was even like, gosh, should I even put up, like I had like the car salesmen and the sex workers, and the fact that I'm even using them as an example as like, we stigmatize these people. I don't mean to legitimize the stigmatization because it's horrible, but I think it is remarkable that they sort of have their own identity process of, let's say, shielding themselves against that stigmatization. And that's what I really want to focus on. So there are all these strategies that you can read about in terms of the sense making that they do, but importantly, as a group in the work culture, to buffer themselves against these the harmful messages that could damage their self-esteem. Remember, this main motivator for having these social identities. And then that is ultimately, again, this is the outcome that, the authors are talking about is work role identification of dirty workers. Like, again, this gets back to the question of why would people identify? And he's saying, why would people identify with a role or a profession or a group of people that other people find, dirty or reprehensible in some way? But I think that this also explains like how they can feel called to the work, right? But it's just, I guess at the end of the day, what I would like you to take away from this, I know it's sort of a complicated model here, and you don't have to worry about all of these uh, P's. These are all these premises that could be tested. And he has done some of this work afterwards, but don't get that. But just looking at sort of this picture of how it all starts with social work group culture. It's all about, oops, sorry, that social support. It allows them to engage in all of these like really meaningful um, defenses against other people's perceptions, but also I think reinforcement of the positive messages that they give each other. And then that leads to work role identification. And like I said, I would argue that this is also a calling. So, um, okay. Finally, the last part of this unit is we're going to be talking about identity construction through narrative or narrative identities. And as I mentioned before, I would recommend while you start to process this, so the reading assigned for the last week in this unit was McAdams and McLean, 2013, but you might want to go back to that Ashforth et al. 2008 chapter that we kicked off the unit with, because they also talked about a lot of this stuff, and there's a lot of overlap. Again, people are sometimes using different words to explain the same thing, but I'm going to try to like gel it for you here. So basically, narrative identity or identity construction through narrative it is what I kind of asked at the beginning of the semester when I wanted you to post on the board and tell me like, what is your narrative identity? I didn't tell you that what is your professional identity? I did not tell you that it needed to be a narrative, but if you go back and look, a lot of people did it in narrative format anyway. I think that us describing things in a story format, which is what this whole thing is all about, it comes very naturally to us as humans, right? We love stories and we explain a lot of things in stories. It's entertaining, but it also helps us remember. And the reason I like this so much is because I think it also helps us make sense of things. Even if we don't share our narrative with anyone, the idea that we construct a narrative in our own head where we see ourselves as the protagonist in our own story helps us make sense of things. So I pulled these, and they are combined. I can't even remember where I got them from, but they're in your readings. I pulled these definitions. Um, so what is it? A creation of identity from episodic memories and envisioned goals. So it's about the past and it's about the future, linking moments over time, generating a story that integrates who am I now, who have I been, and who might I become. So it really is like the full sort of trajectory of, and I'm gonna your life. Now we're gonna be I don't need to know your life story, although of course all these things overlap. You're gonna need to construct an identity, um, a narrative of your professional identity, and obviously that's going to pull from other parts of your life and your identity, but same basic premise, right? When you think about yourself as a professional, as far as what you contribute to the world now, but also what you want to contribute and how you sort of got here through your own experiences. And I wanted to talk about these terms here a little bit because it's all part of the process. And I think I didn't even mean to, but I was like, oh shoot, I'll tell them what that means later. Um, I use the term sense making a lot. Sense making is a term just to say like how you make sense of things, how you understand reality. And you do this by going back and thinking about what you know, different experiences you've had to sort of like shed light on like what's happening to you now. You're trying to figure out what's going on. You walk into a new organization and you're trying to make sense of how they do things, right? What you're going to be doing is pulling from past experience and different observations you have to make sense about it. Um, through the filter of your, sorry, that's a cuckoo clock, through the filter of your existing beliefs and values and things like that. I engage in sense making a lot with friends. So talking to other people is one way. Some people like can do it silently. I like to do it out loud. Writing can help you with sense making, right? People, if you take a journal or diary, like all of these things help you just kind of figure out what the F is going on, right? That's sense making. And we do it in relation to all different types of scenarios. Sense giving is when you help other people make sense of something. And this could be direct or indirect, right? So when you are in an organization and somebody's just sort of like volunteering information about how things are done, that's sense giving. I mean, I'm not saying that they understand that they understand that they're saying something like that in that way. You probably do this all the time too, but it's something that contributes to how people make sense of things. So it's sort of like a social force that comes in to affect other people's sense making. Um, and both of these things are done to reduce identity tension. We feel tension when there are things we don't know, when there are gaps in our knowledge. And the more that we can sense make, or the more that people can give us sense about what's going on, the less tension we have. But then, and this is specifically from the Ashforth article, they talk about this idea of sense breaking. And this is something that happens when there's some sort of shift in the force, when something happens to make you question yourself. Maybe you thought, for instance, that you were going to do great on an exam, and then you didn't do so good. That is like a sense breaking moment that you're like, well, wait a second. Should I even be in this master's program? Is this even for, like, I thought that like I was on the right path here, but that's like a sense breaking, moment. And this is sense breaking is something that increases identity tensions. And what you really want to do is get back into the sort of like the sense making mode. Like, I need to understand reality again, but I just had this break in sense, right? Um, and the thing is, the sense breaking is really helpful, actually, because these are the moments that make us sort of figure out where we need to go, and that trigger us to be more introspective in what's going on. And the reason I bring this up is because so the other reading that you read, which talks about, again, not specifically professional. Doesn't talk about professional identity narratives, but it just talks about like identity narratives in general. And when people are sort of asked to like explain their story and make sense of things, they talk a lot about those moments. They talk a lot about like adversity that they've had, and this is where I'm trying to connect the two readings. Adversity is important because adversity is what triggers those sense is what triggers sense breaking. Okay. Um, it's how people deal with suffering or unexpected negative events usually, right? And the good news is like those are like the opportunities. I know it sounds like kind of a cliche, but there's really a lot of research to support this, that when people have that adversity, when they go through the sense breaking process, that's really the strongest moments that emerge when you study people's narrative identity, that identity that they have as a product of where they've been, where they are, and where they're going. Okay. Um, and it makes sense then. So the other thing that they mentioned in this reading when they were talking about this is like, if you really start to study people's narrative identity, right, you have the adversity, but the other theme is redemption, that people who successfully make sense of their narratives and, or, you know, or let me put it, when I say successfully, let's say this, when they have a strong narrative identity, one that is psychologically beneficial, they tend to be able to process adversity with the theme of redemption. And, you know, one of the things I want to point out as you're reading through, and it is a short reading, so hopefully, you know, if your eyes are glazing over with some of the longer ones, this one like will get you before like you're, you know, I mean, before it becomes too much. But the I'm sorry. Shh. No. These are other dogs. They're, where are they? I can't figure out. Okay, I can't see them. Wait. Yeah, there are dogs back there. Those are my pugs. Um, anyway, yeah, thanks. Now you completely derailed me. I had almost gotten through without any animal interruptions. Okay. The ideal, right, is to have a narrative identity that is built on the redemption from different types of adversity. But not everybody has this. And when you read this lovely article, they talk a lot about the developmental components of narrative identity when people start to do this. And one of the things that really stuck with me in the article is like, not everybody does it well. And it's not always helpful for people to have to try to construct their identity in terms of a narrative, because if they're unable to sort of go through the process where they can see the redemptive qualities of the adversity that they had, or like the stories, then it's going to be stressful and it's not necessarily going to be psychologically beneficial for them. And at this point, you might be saying, well, gee, Dr. Cohen, why the hell would you have us do this then? And I think because what I'm thinking is you can force it. It is a learned skill. Some of you, most of you actually, are probably already naturally good at it, even if you don't engage in it. And actually, I shouldn't say naturally, because I don't mean to minimize sort of the work that goes into this. The article will talk a lot about the role that parents play in helping children develop these skills and things, but friends do this. You know, it's just the idea of like being able to articulate what you've been through and seek meaning in it. And this table, examples of life story constructs used in research and narrative identity, is just a complicated way of saying these are a lot of things that keep popping up when people give narratives about their identity. Different events and different moments in their history or trajectory that help them see something about themselves, about their identity more clearly. And these are the types of things that I hope you'll be able to, these are the reason I wanted you to see this is these are all examples of things that I hope that you'll be able to find in your own professional identity narrative that will help you make greater sense out of the work you're doing or the work you want to do, or even some of the struggles you might have with not being sure about like sort of what you want to do. And it is something that's always in flux. So yeah, that's actually all I have, which I know you're like, well, God, that was a long time for something that not yeah, well, whatever. But remember, it's only one summary lecture, so you can maybe watch us in pieces. Although if you're at the end of it now, I guess it's too late. So sorry about that. Okay, well, anyway, thank you very much. This is concludes the first summary lecture of Unit 1 for the class, and I will see you for the second one. Bye.